Luke watched the flames tumble up the ancient oaks, their amber tongues licking the night sky as though trying to swallow the moon. The scent of pine sap mingled with the metallic tang of blood that still clung to the air from the earlier chaos, a lingering reminder that the ceremony had been ripped from the forest floor and tossed aside like a discarded crown. He pulled his coat tighter, feeling the weight of the Alpha's crest on his chest press against the fibers, a cold mockery of the honor he'd just watched dissolve. The heat from the blaze warmed the backs of his hands, but his fingers stayed rigid, the veins in his forearms pulsing with a rhythm that matched the distant, angry howls of his pack. He scanned the clearing for any sign of Serena's fleeing form, but the crowd was a blur of shifting shadows and snarling faces, the older wolves' stone seats slick with rain that had turned to ice. A silvered spear lay broken at his feet, its tip chipped, the haft splintered, proof that someone had tried to pierce his resolve. An ember drifted down, landing on the soot-covered hem of his trousers, and for a heartbeat he imagined the fire licking his skin, as if the world wanted to burn him from the inside out. Then his eyes caught a dark shape huddled beneath a rusted fire escape that jutted from the back wall of an abandoned storefront a few blocks away. The figure was small, wrapped in a tattered blanket that had seen better days, a stray cat curled at the foot like a living scarf. Something about the posture, shoulders hunched, chin tucked, triggered a memory deeper than the scar on his left forearm, deeper than the night he'd once forced a stranger to leave his territory. The way the firelight reflected off a silver chain around the woman's neck, the faint glint of something metallic near her wrist, he realized with a sudden, involuntary breath catching in his throat that it was her. Maya. He felt his heart strike his ribs like a drumbeat he'd been silencing for years. The woman he'd once held under the full moon, whose eyes had glittered with both terror and something fierce, now looked like a ghost caught in the wreckage of his disgrace. She was thinner than he remembered, the harsh lines of the street carved into her face, a jagged scar half hidden behind her left ear where a fang had once grazed. Her hair, once a cascade of loose curls, hung in damp, tangled strands that clung to her cheekbones. The cat brushed against her hand, and she flinched, as if the slightest touch might undo her fragile shield. Luke took a step forward, the crunch of broken glass under his boots sounding louder than the howling wind. He could feel the eyes of the council, seasoned alphas with years of tradition etched into their brows, watching his every move, judging his impulse to abandon the pack's expectations. The urge to command, to issue orders, rose like a tide, but another, quieter tide rose in his chest. Protect. He swallowed the polished corporate veneer that usually steadied his voice, and let a slower, more vulnerable tone slip out. Maya, he said, the name heavy in his throat, barely louder than the wind. What are you doing here? She stiffened, the cat arched its back, and her gaze flicked up, landing on his suit, the crisp cut of a designer jacket that seemed out of place amid the grime of the street. There was a brief flash of recognition, a flicker of something that had been buried under years of survival instincts. She shifted, pulling the blanket tighter, the fabric rustling like dry leaves. Don't you have anyone to talk to, Ashford? She retorted, her voice edged with sarcasm that masked an underlying tremor. Or are you just here to make sure the pack doesn't lose another precious relic? He could smell the faint trace of his own wolf oil on his skin, a scent that should have been comforting, but it only intensified the cold knot in his stomach. The memory of the night they'd met surged, her breath shallow, his heart racing, the moon hanging low, the primal pull that had made them both forget the world. He remembered the way she'd laughed when he tried to hide his shifter's scent, the way she'd challenged his authority with a question that still echoed in his mind. What does it mean to be alpha if you're afraid to trust? Did you think I'd leave you on that hill? He asked, the edge of his tone softening as he stepped closer, the heat from his own body mingling with the chill of the night. I'm not here to judge you. Maya's eyes narrowed, pupils dilating as she processed his words. She could taste the metallic tang of fear in her mouth, the same taste she'd felt when she first saw the wolf's eyes, reflected in a river of blood. Her hand twitched, the blanket slipping just enough to reveal a silver locket she'd hidden beneath the fabric, a tiny wolf's tooth. the one he'd given her in protest of the pack's rules, a relic she'd kept secret for years. The cat hissed, a low warning that seemed to vibrate through the concrete. "You're a mess of contradictions, Luke," she said, the words slipping out like a half-remembered song. "You're the one who sent me away, told me I didn't belong. Now you're a savior? Do you even know why I'm here?" He felt the old, familiar sting of guilt flicker, his mind flashing back to the night the pack's elders whispered about his mother's death, the vows he'd made to never repeat her betrayal. The wind tugged at the edges of his coat, as if trying to peel back layers he'd built around himself. He wanted to reach out, to close the distance, but the council's eyes burned like coals in his peripheral vision. Exile, loss, the collapse of everything he'd built. "Because you're still breathing," he answered, voice low enough that only she could hear. "And because I can't." He stopped, the words catching on a memory of a broken promise he'd made to himself after his mother's funeral, a promise that no one would ever see the cracks in his armor. The firelight caught the silver chain on her neck, casting a thin line of light across his cheek, and he realized that this moment was a trap he'd set for himself. The very thing he feared, being seen vulnerable, had arrived in the form of Maya, the woman he'd once forced to run. A distant horn blared, the sound of a siren slicing through the night, and a sudden clatter of bone-dry leaves fluttered on the wind, like a warning the forest itself was whispering. He could hear a muffled conversation among the council members behind the stone chairs, their voices low and urgent, talking about exile, about the next step in the war with a rival pack, about Luke's broken image. The threat of a decision he hadn't yet made pressed against his chest, the internal battle between duty and a desperate, unspoken longing. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward an overturned crate near the fire escape. He lowered himself with a controlled grace, the polished leather of his shoes barely making a sound on the rough concrete. Meyer eyed him warily, the cat curling further into a defensive ball. He pulled his jacket off, the sleek fabric sliding over his skin, revealing a toned but tired torso. The alpha's crest on his chest was no longer a symbol for the pack, but a weight he could feel against his ribs, a reminder of the expectations that had hollowed out his own desires. He placed his hand on the crate, feeling the cold metal bleed into his palm, grounding him. Maya hesitated, then slid down, the blanket slipping, revealing a thigh scar, pale, jagged, a reminder of a past hunt gone wrong. The cat brushed against her leg, stirring a shiver that traveled up her spine. She let out a half-laugh that sounded like a cough. "Nice coat, must have cost more than my entire shelter," she muttered, eyes flicking to the expensive watch peeking from beneath his cuff. "You ever think about how funny it is? One minute I'm on the streets, the next I'm sitting on a crate next to the big man who could have a whole city at his fingertips." He let a tiny smile threaten his lips, the sensation of his smile being a rare thing, like a crack in a hardened wall. "You always had a way of finding the cheap side of everything." She rolled her eyes, but his words landed in the space between them, as if she could hear the echo of his own fear in the way he joked about his wealth. Her gaze lingered on the silver locket, the wolf's tooth catching the firelight. She clenched her fist, nails digging into the blanket, a thin line of blood blossoming at the fingertip, a reminder that she still carried wounds she kept hidden. For a heartbeat, she seemed to weigh her options: stay, fight, flee again. The sound of distant footsteps across the street, the muffled thump of a police car's tires, the echo of council members' boots in the forest, a loop of external pressure that would later tighten around them both. She could have bolted, disappearing back into the shadows where she felt safe, but something unnameable, maybe the memory of his warm hand on her back that night, the scent of wet earth after a hunt, kept her rooted. "My name's not Meyer anymore," she whispered, voice almost swallowed by the wind. "They call me the woman who survived, the shadow, the cheap royalty. I'm tired of it." He felt a pang of something like protectiveness, an instinct that had always been buried under corporate strategies, now bubbling up like a tide. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the blanket, warm against the cold cotton, a simple contact that carried the weight of unspoken promises. He could feel the tremor in her hand, the faint pulse at the base of her thumb, a rhythm that matched his own, though out of sync. "You're still here," he said, the words feeling like a confession, "even if the world thinks you're astray." She pulled the blanket tighter, the cat's fur rustling, and the fire's orange glow painted half of her face in light, half in shadow. The juxtaposition reminded him of how she'd once stood in the moonlight, half illuminated by his pack's fire, half cloaked in the darkness of the woods. He could smell the faint scent of burnt rubber from a distant car crash, the tang of gasoline that lingered on the streets, mingling with the smell of his own wolf oil, a potent mixture that seemed to anchor them both to the present yet pull them toward memories they feared to face. A sudden gust knocked a loose piece of newspaper from a gutter, spiraling down to land at their feet, an article half visible: "Rival pack leaders accuse Alpha of weakness." The headline fluttered, a reminder that the external war was far from over, that the council would not wait for personal resolution. The newspaper's cheap ink smeared with rain, another loop, a thread that would tug at them later. Maya's eyes flicked to it, then back to Luke, a hint of sarcasm returning to her tone. "Looks like your council's already planning your excommunication," she said, a smirk playing at the edge of her mouth. He swallowed, his throat tight. "Maybe I need a new council." The words were a half-joke, half-truth, a seed of rebellion against the tradition that had kept them both in cages. She let out a soft, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "You think you can rewrite the pack's laws? That's a nice dream, Alpha. Just don't forget that the people you're trying to protect might not want your protection." A siren wailed farther away, the sound stretching across the night, an ominous reminder that the city never sleeps, that the world beyond the forest was indifferent to their personal histories. In that moment, the fire's light dimmed as a gust of wind snuffed a few embers, casting the clearing into a deeper darkness punctuated only by the distant howl of wolves, a sound that seemed both a warning and a lament. Luke felt the weight of his decision settle like a stone in his gut. He could walk away, return to the council's stone chairs, let Maya disappear into the night, keep his reputation intact. Or he could stay, invite a woman who embodied everything he feared: vulnerability, loss, the possibility of being abandoned again, into the sanctum of his life. His hand lingered on the edge of the crate, the cool metal grounding his trembling thoughts. He could hear the faint thud of his own heart, a rhythm that matched the distant drum of hooves on distant ground. The night air pressed against his cheeks, cold enough to sting, yet somehow invigorating. Maya's voice cut through his reverie, low and edged with something like hope. "You have a choice, Luke. I'm not here because I expect a rescue. I'm here because I know you're the only one who's ever seen me when I wasn't a broken thing." He inhaled deeply, tasting the coppery scent of the fire mixed with the damp concrete and the subtle perfume of the cat's fur. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to make the first move. He reached out, not with the commanding hand of an alpha, but with the uncertain, tentative touch of a man who had spent his life building walls. His fingers brushed the cat's cheek, then lingered on the strap of Maya's blanket, the fabric soft under his palm. The simple contact sent a current through both of them, an echo of that night under the full moon, a reminder that the same spark still lingered beneath the ash. He glanced back toward the forest, where the pack's elders still sat in stone chairs, silhouettes against the dying light. Their eyes were not on him now, but on the distant horizon where rival wolves prowled. A new loop formed in his mind, a shadowy figure watching from the tree line, a wolf with a scar across its eye, whose allegiance was still unknown. "Come inside," he said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. "You can't stay out here any longer, not with the night getting colder." Maya hesitated, eyes flicking to the cat, then back to him. The silence stretched, filled with the crackle of dying flames and the distant rumble of police sirens. She pulled the blanket tighter, then, with a small, defiant sigh, nodded. "Fine. But I'm not staying forever, Ashford. I'm not a project." He smiled, a brief flash that barely reached his eyes, then turned toward the street, the penthouse doors looming ahead like a promise or a prison. As they walked, the fire's glow faded behind them and the city's neon lights flickered on, casting a cold, artificial glow over the wet pavement. The cat slipped from Maya's arms, disappearing into an alley, leaving a faint trail of scent that seemed to linger in the air, a reminder that the world they were stepping into was full of unseen eyes, hidden agendas, and a future that would demand more than just a second chance. Maya pressed the back of her hand against the cracked brick, feeling the cold seep into her skin as the wind slipped through the narrow alley. The city's neon hummed overhead, a garish pink that painted the wet pavement in a sickly glow. She could taste the metallic tang of rain in her mouth, each breath a thin thread of steam that disappeared before it could settle. Somewhere nearby, a garbage truck rattled, its hydraulic sigh echoing like a distant beast waking from a slumber. She tried not to notice the way Luke's silhouette lingered at the entrance of the penthouse, the halo of light from his floor-to-ceiling windows cutting through the darkness like a blade. He had offered her a room, a hot shower, a place to dry the tremor from her shoulders. The words felt like a promise, but his eyes carried the weight of a man whose life was a ledger of obligations. Maya's mind flickered to the silver locket she had hidden under the blanket, a wolf's tooth she kept for lack of anything else to hold onto. The fact that Luke had noticed it, even for a heartbeat, made the scar behind her ear sting with something that was neither shame nor triumph, but a raw reminder that the night they first met was still a wound she had tried to stitch over with ash. She moved toward the hallway, each step a careful negotiation between the urge to bolt and the need to stay. The hallway smelled of polished wood and faint lavender, a stark contrast to the sewage underneath the city. Luke's door was open, the soft thrum of a low-frequency music seeping out, the kind of track a corporate exec would let play to mask the hum of his own thoughts. He was standing by a glass table, his fingers tracing the edge of a ceramic mug as if measuring the distance between himself and whatever he was trying to say. "What's the word on the street?" he asked, voice lower than a whisper but firm enough to carry across the room. He didn't turn, his back to her, and the light caught the cut of his jaw, making the alpha's crest on his chest glint like a warning. Maya swallowed, feeling the cat's fur still clinging to the inside of her cuff. "They're saying the council's moving fast. Some pack raven has been spotted near the river. They're fishing for a reason, and I'm not sure if it's just a raid or something bigger. I saw a scout with a red feather in his cap. Might be a sign." He paused, the mug hovering at the rim of the table, the faint scent of his cologne sharp pine with a hint of earth mixed with the subtle musk of his wolf form, a scent that had once made her heart race. "Red feather," he repeated, as if testing the syllables. "Raven's emblem is a crow. Something's off. I need to know who's feeding them intel." Maya's gaze drifted to the window, where the river below churned with an angry rush, its surface catching the city lights like broken glass. She could hear the distant howl of wolves, a mournful echo that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "You think someone's using the river as a meeting point," she said, voice edged with sarcasm that barely covered the tremor in her hand. "Maybe it's just a coincidence, maybe it's a trap. Either way, the council's going to want answers, and I'm not about to be the one who lets them find them first." He finally turned, the movement smooth, almost predatory. The scar on his left forearm caught the light, a silent testament to a past he rarely spoke about. "You've been on the streets longer than anyone I've known who can run a hunt," he said, the words sliding out with a practiced ease. "You see things most of us miss. That could be useful." Maya's laugh was short, a bark that barely rose above the hum of the building's ventilation. "Youthful? I'm a survivor, Luke. I'm not a pawn in any political game you're playing." She shifted, the blanket slipping to reveal the faint line of a stitch near her wrist, the place where a fang had once grazed her skin. The memory of that night, of the moonlight catching the sheen of his eyes, the way his hand had brushed against hers before he pulled away, flashed like a broken photograph, each fragment jagged and unfinished. He stepped closer, the floorboards creaking under his weight, a subtle reminder that even in this place of luxury, the old wood still remembered its roots. You're right, I'm not playing a game. I'm trying to keep a pack from tearing itself apart. His voice softened, the edge of command giving way to something that could have been regret. And you're not a pawn. You're the only thing that makes sense of the chaos right now. She felt the heat of his breath on the back of her neck, the faint scent of wet pine and wolf oil mingling with the city's exhaust fumes. A stray cat slunk back into the shadows, its tail flicking like a metronome. The cat's sudden movement made Maya's hand flinch, the blanket sliding again to reveal a small bruise on her shoulder, fresh enough to still sting. She clenched her jaw, a habit formed from years of swallowing pain. You think you can just walk into my life and fix everything because you have a title? She asked, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the flicker of doubt behind his polished exterior. Do you ever wonder if you're just filling a void you're not supposed to? Luke's shoulders tightened, a subtle shift that made the console of his suit rustle. I've spent my whole life filling voids someone else left, he'd admitted, his voice barely more than a murmur. The council thinks I'm the one who can hold them together. They don't see the cracks in my foundation. You saw them once, when the moon was full and I was too scared to hold on. The air grew heavier, the scent of rain mixing with the faint perfume of the lavender diffuser, a scent that pricked at Maya's nose like a memory she could not place. She pressed the locket tighter against her chest, feeling the cold metal bite into her skin. That night, she said, you told me to leave because you thought I'd bring the pack down. You said I'd be a liability. I've carried that ever since, like a weight around my neck. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the edge of the blanket, fingers trembling slightly as if unsure whether to touch or retreat. I was afraid, he whispered, the words slicing the noise of the city beyond the glass. Afraid that if I held on to you, I'd lose the pack. I thought I could protect them by letting you go. Maya's eyes filled with a muted light, the neon reflecting off the tears she hadn't allowed herself to feel. The cat emerged from the shadows, its fur damp, and brushed against her leg, a soft, reluctant purr rising like a secret. She lifted her hand, fingers brushing the edge of his, the contact electric, a surge that traveled through the scar on her ear and the fresh wound on his forearm. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sensation of skin against skin, the taste of iron in their mouths, the sound of their own breathing sinking like a chorus. Maybe we're both scared of the same thing, Maya said, her voice a low rasp that seemed to match the distant howl outside. Maybe the only thing keeping us from falling is this. She gestured to the space between them, a thin line of tension that could snap or become a rope. He nodded, the move deliberate, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Then we stop pretending the past is dead. He turned, his gaze landing on the red feather tucked into the pocket of his blazer, a small token he had found when he first entered the penthouse. And we start looking at what's coming. A siren wailed again, its shrill cry cutting through the quiet of the hallway, a reminder that the city never rested. The council's emissary was due at his door in an hour, and the Raven Pack's scout was already on the move. The river's current rushed louder, a phantom of blood beneath the surface. Maya slipped the locket back under the blanket, the wolf's tooth catching the dim light one last time before disappearing. You want me to help you with the council, with the pack, she said, each word a blade sharpened by necessity. But I'm not your project, Luke. I'm not your redemption arc. I'm still figuring out how to survive. He stared at the red feather, then at her, his eyes softening just enough to betray a flicker of something else, maybe hope, maybe fear. Then let's survive together, he said, the words hanging in the stale air like a promise that could crumble or hold firm. The cat slipped away, disappearing into the night, leaving a faint trail of scent that lingered like a secret. Maya glanced at the door, the hallway beyond, and felt the pull of the river's current, the weight of the council's gaze, and the undeniable, reluctant connection that had begun to knit their broken edges together. She took a breath, the city scent filling her lungs, and stepped forward, the floorboard cracking under her weight, a sound that echoed the first note of a new, uncertain melody. Luke's hand hovered over the cold metal of the radiator, the heat of the firelight still clinging to his skin. He felt the weight of the locket against Maya's chest, a faint pulse that matched the rhythm of his own heart. The city hummed beyond the glass, a low drone of traffic that seemed to quiet when their eyes met. He saw the scar on her ear, the way it caught the light like a notch in a blade, and the memory of the night they first tasted each other's fear rose unbidden. "Maya," he said, voice barely louder than the hiss of the central heating, "I've been chasing shadows for years." He let the words slip, each syllable a thin rope stretched between them. She laughed once, a short, dry sound that made the cat in the hallway flick its tail. "And I've been running from shadows you can't see." Her fingers brushed the edge of the blanket, the fabric whispering against his thumb. A gust rattled the windowpane, pulling a smear of rain across the glass as if the storm outside were trying to peek in. He stepped closer, the plush rug muffling his boots, and felt the subtle shift of her posture. She leaned back just enough to expose the thin line of a healed wound on her wrist. The scent of pine from his cologne mingled with the metallic tang of the city rain, a strange perfume that made his throat tighten. Their faces hovered inches apart, the space charged with the static of a hunt long postponed. He could hear the distant howl of wolves, a reminder of the pack's expectations, and the faint ticking of a clock hidden behind a bookshelf, a reminder that time was already slipping away. Maya's breath hit his cheek, warm and ragged, and for a heartbeat he tasted the iron of his own fear. Without a word, his hand rose, fingertips finding the cold metal pendant she kept hidden. The metal was cool, but the pressure of his grip sent a shock through her skin, as if the ghost of that moonlit night had brushed against them once more. She didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed the other hand to his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his wolf heart beneath the fabric. The sudden clatter of a messenger's knock echoed down the hallway, the sound sharp and out of place. Luke's eyes flickered to the door, where a shadow lingered, an emissary in a dark coat, his coat badge glinting faintly. The messenger's presence hung like a thread, a loop that promised counsel, judgment, and a rival pack's intrusion. Maya's gaze snapped back to his, a spark of defiance lighting her eyes. "We're not safe here," she whispered, and the words trembled like leaves in a gust. He closed the distance, their foreheads touching, the heat of his body searing the chill from her skin. The moment stretched, a fragile bridge between what was and what could be, while the distant hiss of sirens rose, signaling a patrol that could see them at any second. In that breath-shared silence, the kiss landed soft, urgent, a promise stitched over old wounds. The kiss lingered, and as they finally pulled apart, both felt the lingering ache of unspoken lies and the sudden certainty that the past had shifted, leaving a new path ahead, even as the council's footsteps grew louder outside the penthouse's doors. Luke slipped the key into the lock of the penthouse's second-floor hallway and felt the cool metal of the doorframe under his palm. The hallway smelled of polished mahogany, faint lavender from a diffuser tucked beside a framed photograph of his father. The picture showed a younger man in a crisp suit, arm draped over a woman in a flowing dress. Their smiles were practiced, the kind of staged happiness he'd learned to mimic at board meetings. He caught a glimpse of his own reflection in the dark glass of the window's sharp cheekbones, the faint ghost of a scar on his left forearm, then turned, hearing Maya's soft footfalls behind him. She paused at the doorway, the blanket still draped over her shoulders, the cat tucked against her thigh. The city's neon seeped through the glass, painting the carpet with a bruised violet that made her skin look paler. Her fingers trembled as she brushed the strap of the blanket, the fabric whispering against the polished wood. A low hum of an air conditioner rose, mixing with the distant siren that pulsed like a heartbeat outside. "Kitchen's open," Luke said, his voice low enough that only the hallway's paint could hear it. "Coffee's still hot." Maya's eyes flicked to the faint steam curling from the espresso machine on the marble counter. The smell of fresh coffee struck her like a memory of mornings she'd never had, a scent that seemed to pull a sliver of comfort from the cold concrete she was used to. She swallowed, feeling the metallic taste of rain still on her tongue, and stepped into the kitchen, the cool tiles sending a shiver up her calves. She set the blanket on a low stool and let the cat jump onto the countertop, its fur brushing against the sleek surface. "You've got a lot of appliances," she observed, picking up a sleek stainless steel kettle and feeling the weight of it in her hand. The kettle's curve reminded her of the moon's half-crescent shape, a reminder of that night in the woods. Luke leaned against the island, watching the way her shoulders rose and fell with each breath, the way the neon's pink light caught the silver chain around her neck. He noticed the way her left palm lingered on the edge of the counter, the faint line of a healed wound near her wrist, a reminder of that fanged scar from years before. He wanted to reach out, to trace the scar with his thumb, but the council's eyes were a phantom in the back of his mind, a pressure that kept his hand from moving. "Raven Pack's scouts have been spotted near the river," he said, trying to sound casual. "They're gathering intel, and I can't afford a blind spot." Maya's gaze flicked to the window, where the river's dark water reflected the city's skyline like shattered glass. The sound of distant water lapped against the pier, a low rumble that seemed to echo the growl of wolves she'd once heard. She crossed to the fridge, opened the door, and pulled out a plastic container of leftover ramen. The plastic crinkled, releasing a faint scent of broth and oil that reminded her of the cheap meals she'd survived on. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, holding the container up like a bargaining chip. "Stir the pot of politics and hope it doesn't boil over." Luke let out a breath that fogged the kitchen's glass dome. He moved closer, the faint scent of pine in his cologne mingling with the coffee, a grounding aroma that reminded him of the forest floor. "You're good at reading people," he said, pulling a seat for her. "You see the cracks where others see wood. I need eyes that look beyond the obvious." She sat, the chair scraping softly against the tile, and set the ramen down. The cat hopped onto her lap, purring against her thigh, its fur warm and damp from the night's rain. Maya's fingers brushed the cat's ear, feeling the roughness of a scar on her own forearm from a previous hunt, the reminder that she still carried wounds she couldn't hide. "You know why I'm here," she said, voice low, each word a careful stitch. "Not because you want a trophy, but because you need someone who can navigate the shadows without getting tangled in the pack's expectations." Luke's jaw tightened. He heard the distant howl of a lone wolf, a note that seemed to reverberate in his chest. He reached for the kettle, lifted it, and poured hot water over the ramen, steam curling like the breath of the forest fire that had burned his wedding altar. The broth hissed, a sound that reminded him of the crackling flames and the way the fire had illuminated the emptiness he felt after Serena fled. He turned the kettle, the metal cooling under his fingertip. "I can't promise safety," he admitted, his eyes flickering to the cat's eyes, bright, green, unblinking. "But I can promise I won't push you away the way I did before." Maya watched the steam rise, the condensation forming tiny droplets on the glass, each one a mirror of the tears she'd hidden for years. She let the silence linger, feeling the weight of his words settle like ash on the hearth. The cat's purr rose, a steady thrum that seemed to anchor her to the present. She reached across the counter, her palm brushing his forearm where the scar throbbed faintly under the skin. The contact sent a jolt of electric awareness through both of them, a reminder that the blood that ran in their veins was not just human but also something older, something that answered to the moon. "Do you still hear them?" she asked, her voice barely above the kettle's whistle. "The wolves, the pack when you're alone?" Luke closed his eyes for a heartbeat, listening to the low growl that rose from deep within his chest, the scent of wolf oil thickening in his pores. "Every night," he said, opening his eyes to meet hers. "It's like a drum that never stops. It reminds me of the promise I made to my mother, never let anyone see the cracks. I've been building walls so high even I can't see the sunrise." Maya's laugh was a short, sharp exhale, the sound of someone who had learned to mask pain with sarcasm. "And now you're letting me climb over them?" He tilted his head, a faint smile curving his lips. "Only if you promise not to break them." She pressed her thumb against his scar, feeling the raised tissue, the faint pulse beneath. "I'll try," she whispered, "but you have to let me see the cracks first." He nodded, his throat tightening as he swallowed the old habit of swallowing pride whole. He turned to the fridge, pulling out a bottle of water. The plastic clicked, a tiny, crisp sound that made Maya's eyes flick to the shelf where a worn leather journal sat, its cover cracked and stamped with the Ashford crest. "Found this in the study," Luke said, holding it out. "It's my mother's well, it belonged to her. She kept notes on pack history, on leadership. I thought maybe you'd want to see it." Maya took the journal, the leather warm from his hand, the edges frayed like a tide-worn rope. She opened it, the pages whispering as she turned them, each one filled with cramped handwriting, dates, and sketches of wolves in various stances. The scent of old paper rose, mingling with the coffee and the metallic tang of rain on the windowsill. She ran a finger over a passage that spoke of a pack that survived by sharing burdens, the text illuminated by the neon's flicker. Her eyes lingered on a line: "A leader who hides his fear breeds a pack that fears the night." She looked up, meeting Luke's gaze, and saw the flicker of something she hadn't seen before: vulnerability unmasked. He watched her, noticing the way the light caught the silver tooth on her necklace, the tiny wolf's fang glinting like a secret promise. He felt the old fear of abandonment creeping, whispering that if he let her see the scar, she would leave. He fought it, a silent battle between instinct and desire. "Your mother," Maya began, then stopped, the words caught in her throat. She must have been something." Luke's mouth twitched. "She was the only one who ever called me by my name, not my title." He swallowed, the sound of his throat like a scrape against stone. "I think I've been trying to live up to the legend she left behind, not the woman she was." Maya closed the journal, the leather thudding softly against the counter. "Legends are stories people tell themselves to feel less alone," she said, voice softening. "If you keep writing yours in someone else's ink, you'll never know if it's yours at all." He leaned forward, the scent of his wolf musk strong now, a reminder of his true nature. "What if I wanted to write a new story?" he asked, voice almost a whisper. "One where I'm not just the alpha everyone expects, but someone who can trust." Maya's eyes narrowed, the neon's pink casting shadows that danced across her cheekbones. She rose, moving to the window and pulling the curtain back a fraction, the night wind hitting her face, carrying the scent of wet pine and distant river mud. She inhaled, feeling the cold air fill her lungs, the chill like a reminder of the forest she'd left behind. She turned, her hand finding the cat's fur, rubbing it against her cheek. "Then start by letting me in," she said, her tone equal parts challenge and plea. "Show me the man who can be vulnerable without losing the pack." Luke stepped beside her, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots, and placed a hand on the back of her neck, feeling the tremor in her shoulders. The cat hissed softly, a low growl that resonated like a warning bell. He pressed his palm against her spine, feeling the rise and fall of her breath, the warmth of her skin against his. "You're scared," he observed, the words spilling out like water from the kettle. She tilted her head, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "And you're scared of being scared." He laughed, a short, breathy sound that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're both terrified of the same thing, Maya, losing each other to the very thing we're trying to protect." She leaned in, their foreheads almost touching, the cat's tail flicking in the background. The space between them thrummed with static, a silent promise of something more. He could taste the faint metallic tang of his own blood on his tongue, a reminder of the injury from the raid still healing on his hand. "Do you trust me?" she asked, words barely audible over the hum of the city outside. Luke's throat tightened, his mind flashing to the council's faces, their stern gazes, the whispered decision that could strip him of his title. He swallowed, feeling the weight of the crest on his chest like a stone he'd been forced to wear. He answered not with words but by pressing his palm against the small of her back, a grounding pressure that sent a pulse of heat through her. She exhaled, a breath that seemed to carry years of suppressed doubts. Then let's start with something small, she whispered, pulling a thin notebook from her bag, a worn composition book with frayed edges, its pages filled with sketches of wolves, notes in scrawled ink about transformation techniques. I've been working on controlling the shift. I could use a partner. Luke stared at the notebook, the pages a testimony to her hidden talent, the scent of ink mixed with the faint coppery smell of blood from a past mistake. He felt the old fear rise. If he let her into this part of his world, he might lose control, might endanger the pack. Yet the pull was stronger than the dread. He nodded, the movement deliberate. Teach me, he said, the edge of his voice raw. Show me how to hold the wolf without letting it break us. Meyer opened the notebook to a page where she had drawn a diagram of the wolf's skeletal structure, the markings indicating points of tension. She traced a line with her fingertip, the ink smearing slightly. When you feel the shift starting, focus on the breath, she instructed, her tone shifting to a teacher's calm. Inhale through the nose, feel the air fill your lungs like a river filling a canyon. Exhale slowly, let the tension bleed out through your fingertips. Luke closed his eyes, feeling the cool night air from the open window brush his face, the scent of rain and pine intertwining. He inhaled, the breath filling his chest, the pack's howl echoing faintly in his mind. When he exhaled, he imagined the tension in his shoulders loosening, the weight of his title lightening. They practiced together, the cat watching from the counter, its green eyes flickering with curiosity. Each shift was a jitter of energy that made the room pulse, a subtle warping of the air that made the curtains ripple. Maya's hand rested on his arm, guiding the flow, her fingertips warm against his skin, the scar pulsing faintly under the pressure. The moment they both felt the shift synchronizing, a low hum rose between them, like a shared heartbeat. A sudden knock at the door shattered the intimacy, the sound sharp as a branch snapping. Luke's muscles tensed, his eyes narrowing. He glanced at the hallway, the silhouette of a messenger in a dark coat, the badge on his chest catching the hallway's dim light. The messenger's hand rested on the door, fingers poised. Maya's eyes darted to the intrusion, a flash of wariness crossing her face. "Counsel again?" she muttered, voice low but edged with irritation. Luke swallowed, the taste of coffee gone from his mouth. "Probably," he said, moving toward the door, each step deliberate, the floorboards creaking under his weight. He opened the door a crack, the hallway light spilling in, revealing a man in a plain coat, his jaw set, a folder clutched in his hand. "Alpha Ashford," the messenger said, voice neutral, eyes flicking to the notebook on the counter. "The council requests your presence at the council chamber. They have concerns about your association." Luke's jaw tightened. He caught Maya's stare from the doorway, her lips pressed into a thin line, the cat's tail twitching. He could feel the old pattern, the instinct to protect his image, to retreat from vulnerability surfacing, urging him to shut the door, to keep her hidden. He glanced back at Maya, noting the way her hand hovered near the notebook, the way the cat's ears twitched. He took a breath, the scent of pine mingling with the metallic tang of the messenger's coat. "Tell them I'll be there," he said, voice firm, but his eyes lingered on the notebook, on Maya's face. The messenger nodded, the folder thudding against his chest, and disappeared down the hallway, the door closing with a soft click that seemed louder than it should be. Luke turned back, his shoulders heavy, the weight of the council's summons pressing like an invisible hand. Maya stood there, the notebook clutched to her chest, the cat rubbing against her leg. "You just invited them in," she said, a spark of frustration lighting her eyes. "Now they'll know you're breaking the rules." Luke ran a hand through his hair, the strands slick with the night's humidity. "I need to buy us time," he said, his voice low. "If I can convince them that our partnership strengthens the pack, maybe they'll back off." She shook her head, the motion sending a cascade of water droplets from the blanket onto the floor, each tiny splash catching the light. "You can't convince them with words. They hear the pack's ancient chants, not the new verses we write." He stepped closer, their bodies almost touching, the heat from his skin contrasting with the cool night air seeping through the window. "Then we write them together," he replied, his fingers brushing the scar on her wrist, feeling the faint sting of her old wound. "We show them that trust can be a weapon." Maya stared at him, the cat now perched on the countertop, its green eyes glinting like tiny lanterns. She let out a breath that seemed to release a knot in her chest, the tension easing just enough. "Fine," she said, voice steadier. "But if this ends badly, I'm out. No more alibis, no more hiding." Luke nodded, his own fear of abandonment clawing at his throat, but his decision to stay, to let her in, felt like a tentative step onto a fragile bridge. He turned to the notebook, pulling it onto the kitchen island, the pages fluttering like a bird's wings. He traced his finger over the diagram of the wolf's spine, the lines messy, the ink smudged in places where he'd tried to draw from memory. "Let's start with something simple," he said, sliding a chair toward her. "You teach me the basics of control. I'll show you how the pack works on the political side. If we understand each other's worlds, maybe we can." He stopped, the words hanging, his mind flickering to the council's likely reaction, to the rival pack's scouts, to the distant howl that seemed to grow louder with every breath. He realized the loop he'd opened, the council's demand for his presence, the emissary's warning, his own need to prove he could merge love and leadership. The answer remained out of reach, and not yet to be untied. Meyer opened the notebook, her finger landing on a page labeled Shift Control, Phase 2. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, the cat's tail flicking in rhythm with the ticking clock on the wall. "First, you have to trust the wolf inside you," she said. "You have to let it see the darkness, not just the moon." He leaned in, the side of his nose brushing the scar on her ear, feeling the slight sting of fresh blood that seemed to come from nowhere. He could taste the coppery tang of his own fear, a bitter reminder of his mother's abandonment. He let his breath out slowly, feeling the tension in his shoulders loosen. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant siren's wail. "I'm willing to see the darkness if it means I can keep you the wolf that's become more than a memory." Maya's smile was small, genuine, a flicker of something he hadn't seen in years' hope. She placed her hand over his, the contact warm, the cat's purr growing louder, vibrating through the countertop. "Then let's begin," she said, and together they turned the page, the ink drying as the night deepened outside, the city's neon glow casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, a reminder that the darkness held both danger and the promise of a new beginning. Maya stared at the crackling radiator, the heat licking the edge of the blanket like a promise she didn't trust. The notebook lay open on the kitchen island, its inked diagrams half visible behind a smear of steam from the kettle. "We've got to move before the council shows up," Luke said, his voice tight, the pine scent of his cologne mingling with the metallic tang of rain that still clung to his coat. She flipped a page, the paper rustling against the plastic of the empty ramen container. "I can't run a hunt with you half awake," she replied, a bitter edge lurking under the sarcasm. Her fingers brushed the scar on her wrist, the faint sting reminding her of the night the wolves had turned on her, how a single misstep in the woods had cost a brother's life and left her shunned. The doorbell rang, a dull thud that echoed through the marble hallway. Luke's shoulders snapped forward, a flash of the council's emblem flickering in his mind. He moved to the door, hand hovering over the lock, the weight of his alpha crest pressing against his ribs. "I'll handle this," he muttered, stepping into the dim corridor where the faint hum of the building's ventilation sounded like distant wolves. Maya heard the click of his boots on the cold tile and felt the tremor in her chest rise like a tide. She pressed the notebook against her chest, the leather warm from his fingers, and caught sight of the silver tooth pendant catching the hallway's fluorescent glare. The pendant had once saved a pack member's life, now it seemed a cruel reminder that her own power had cost blood. A messenger in a dark coat appeared, the badge on his lapel glinting like a warning. "Alpha Ashford, the council demands your presence. They've received reports of unauthorized shifter activity inside the city. They suspect you're harboring a rogue. The words landed with the weight of a stone. Luke's jaw clenched, the scar on his forearm pulsing under his shirt. Maya's mind raced. The council's accusation mirrored the night she'd been forced to flee the pack's hunt. Her transformation spiraled out of control, a wolf's howl tearing through the trees, the same howl that had driven Luke to push her away years ago. "You're still hiding me," she whispered, more to the cold wall than to him. He turned, the hallway lights casting long shadows that stretched like hands across his path. "If they think I'm protecting you, then I'm already failing them," he said, his tone flat, a mask of control slipping over his fear. Maya felt the cat stir beneath the blanket, its fur bristling. She slid the locket from under the wool, the wolf's tooth catching a glint of the hallway's neon reflection. "Maybe I'm the problem," she said, voice trembling. "Maybe you're just another pack that can't see past its own legend." The words cut through the stale air, leaving a hollow echo. Luke hesitated, hand on the doorknob, the metal cold against his skin. A distant siren wailed, the sound swelling like a pack's howl, urging him forward. He glanced back at the kitchen, the notebook still open, the inked lines uncompleted. The half-finished diagram of a wolf's spine seemed to mock his unfinished promise. "Until the council decides otherwise," he finally said, stepping away, the door swinging shut with a soft thud that sounded like a final verdict. Maya watched him go, the cat's purr fading into the hallway, and felt the blanket slip from her shoulders, exposing the same scar she had tried to cover for years. The night outside grew colder, the river's current rushing louder, and the echo of the council's summons lingered, a loop waiting to tighten. Luke stood in the hallway of his penthouse, the door still ajar behind him, the scent of rain-soaked concrete clinging to his coat like a second skin. The council's summons pulsed in his pocket, a thin envelope that felt heavier than any ledger he'd ever balanced. He could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation, a low wind that reminded him of the forest breezes he'd once tried to command. The metallic taste of fear lingered on his tongue, but beneath it was the faint, sweet note of pine cologne he'd sprayed earlier, the same scent that always seemed to surface when he was about to make a decision that mattered. He turned back toward the kitchen, the floorboards creaking under his weight, each step a reminder of the distance between the polished marble and the street below. The cat, a mottled stray he'd named Echo, was perched on the counter, its ears flicking as if listening to a distant howl only it could hear. Behind Echo, the notebook lay open on the island, the ink diagram of a wolf's spine half faded, a line of ink missing where he had tried to sketch the vertebrae but stopped, his hand trembling. "Maya," he said, his voice low, the words vibrating against the glass of the window that showed the river's dark current. He could see the reflection of the city lights on the water, the way they rippled like fireflies trapped in glass. "We need to talk about the council, about the raid, about why I'm still here and why you're still." Maya's silhouette emerged from the doorway, the thin blanket draped over her shoulders catching the neon pink glow from the hallway. The blanket's edges were frayed, the fibers worn thin where the city's cold had gnawed at it night after night. She pulled the cat closer, its fur warm against her cheek, and the scent of damp fur rose, mingling with the faint perfume of the lavender diffuser she tried to keep humming in the background. Her eyes, the color of wet slate, scanned the room with a practiced wariness, as if every surface might hide a trap. She set the cat down on the floor and crossed to the island, her boots making a soft thump on the polished surface. "You think I'm staying because you're offering shelter?" she asked, her voice edged with sarcasm that thinly veiled the tremor in her throat. "Because you've got a fancy kitchen and a view that makes the river look like a painted line?" Luke let the silence stretch, feeling the weight of his own crest on his chest, the metal digging into his ribs. "No," he whispered, the word slipping out like a breath caught in winter. "Because I'm tired of running from the things that made us run the first time." He lifted the notebook, the leather warm from his touch, and placed it in front of her. "You taught me how to feel the shift. I want to learn more, not just for the pack, but for us." Maya's fingers brushed the cover, the texture of cracked leather rough against her skin, the faint scent of old paper rising as if the book itself exhaled. She opened to the page where he had drawn the spine, the ink still fresh. You still draw it wrong, she said, a smile flickering at the corners of her mouth, the hint of a laugh that almost sounded like a sigh. The vertebrae aren't supposed to look like a broken fence. He chuckled, the sound low, a crack that seemed to come from deeper than his throat. Then help me fix it. His hand hovered over the page, then rested on the margin, his fingers lingering on the unfinished line. I need you to see what I'm afraid of, not just the battle tactics. He swallowed, feeling the scar on his forearm throb faintly under his shirt, a reminder that any wound he tried to conceal still bled in moments of truth. Maya slipped her hand onto the margin, the ink smearing slightly under her pressure. Fear isn't a line you can draw over, she murmured, her eyes searching his for something he couldn't quite name. It's a scent you wear like the way your cologne always smells of pine and iron after a hunt. It clings to you, even when you try to wash it off. He inhaled, the pine and iron mingling with a faint metallic tang from the rain that had soaked his coat earlier. I've been wearing that scent for years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I wear it because it tells the pack I'm still the alpha they expect, but it also tells them I'm unbreakable, and that's the lie I keep telling myself. She tilted her head, the cat's soft purr vibrating against the counter. What if you stopped trying to be unbreakable? She asked, the question hanging between them like a bead of rain ready to fall. What if you let yourself be broken? Luke's gaze drifted to the window, the river's surface now dark as obsidian, the city's neon reflections creating a kaleidoscope of colors that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. He could feel the blood in his ears, the rush of adrenaline that always accompanied a decision that could shift his whole world. I can't risk the pack, he said, the words sounding rehearsed, the same mantra he'd recited to himself in boardrooms and council chambers. If I let the wolves see me falter, they'll think I'm weak. They'll turn on me. Maya stepped closer, the blanket slipping off one shoulder, revealing a scar that ran down her left forearm, a pale line that caught the light from the kitchen's recessed LEDs. She traced the scar with her fingertip, the scar's texture rough, the skin slightly raised, the memory of that night when a fang had grazed her, pulling at the edge of her consciousness. The pack sees strength in the way you lead, not in the way you hide, she said, her voice softer now, each word a feather landing on a still lake. But they also see when you are honest about your fear. That's what makes a leader worth following. He turned his head, their faces so close the scent of his wolf oil brushed against her cheek, a warm, musky undertone that made her skin prickle. In that moment, the cat let out a low, resonant meow, as if acknowledging the shift in the room's current. He could feel the tremor in his jaw, the way his fingers curled involuntarily around the edge of the counter, nails digging into the polished surface as if to anchor himself. Okay, he said, the word heavy with resolve. We'll try again, not because we're nostalgic for a night under the full moon, but because we've learned the shape of our mistakes. He slid his hand across the table, his fingers brushing the notebook, then lifted it, a gesture that felt like offering a piece of himself he had never before allowed anyone to see. I'll rewrite the pack's law. I'll make space for a mate who isn't just a political pawn. Maya's eyes widened, the spark of hope flickering like a firefly caught in a jar. She hesitated, then placed her hand over his, her palm cool against his warm skin, the contrast of temperatures sending a ripple through both of them. And what about me? She asked, her voice low, the question a thread pulling at a knot she'd tied around her own heart years ago. What do I give to prove I'm not a liability? He squeezed her hand gently, the pressure sending a shock through the scar on his forearm, the memory of his mother's abandonment flaring for a second, then dimming as he focused on the present. You give me honesty, he said, the words landing like stones in a stream. You give me the chance to trust you with what I cannot control. She pulled back slightly, her thumb brushing his knuckles, feeling the faint edge of his scar where bone met skin. The scar pulsed faintly, a reminder that every time he let someone close, The fear of abandonment tightened its grip. "And if they come for us?" she asked, her eyes flickering toward the hallway where the sound of distant footsteps echoed, a messenger's knock still fresh in both their minds. Luke's jaw tightened, the muscles working as if to keep his thoughts from spilling. "Then we make them see that the pack is stronger when it embraces change," he said, his voice steadier now, the tremor replaced by a quiet certainty. He glanced at the clock on the wall, the second hand ticking in a steady rhythm that seemed to mark the passage of time he'd always tried to control. "We'll face the council together. I'll argue for a new covenant, and you'll stand with me, not as a secret, but as an equal." Maya leaned forward, the blanket falling to the floor, exposing the rawness of her shoulder where a faint bruising still marked the night she had lost control. She pressed her palm to the bruise, feeling the tenderness, the echo of the pain that had once made her hide in shadows. "I'll stand with you," she said, the words firm, the promise carrying the weight of all the nights she had slept under broken awnings, the sound of sirens, the taste of cold water on cracked teeth. "But I need you to promise something too." He met her gaze, his eyes reflecting the flickering light from the kitchen's pendant, the soft amber glow that painted shadows on the wall. "What?" She lifted the wolf's tooth pendant from around her neck, the small ivory piece catching the light, the faint scent of old blood still clinging to it, a reminder of the night she had saved a pack member's life with it. "Promise me you won't let the council decide my worth," she whispered, the pendant sliding against her throat, the cool metal biting her skin. "Promise you'll see me as more than a liability, even when the pack whispers about the shifter's danger." Luke's breath hitched, the iron taste of his own blood surfacing, a reminder that each promise he made was a gamble with his own identity. He lifted his own hand, the suit jacket slipping off his shoulders, revealing the crest sewn into the lining of his shirt, the emblem of his lineage pressing against his heart like a weight. "I promise," he said, the word resonating in his chest, the scar on his forearm suddenly feeling less like a wound and more like a map of where he had been. The cat, sensing the shift, hopped onto the counter, its tail flicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound of the soft purring filled the kitchen, a low hum that seemed to sync with the distant howls outside, a reminder that the world beyond their walls was still alive, still watching. The messenger's silhouette lingered in the hallway, a dark shape that had yet to knock again, the envelope still waiting for him to open it and face the council's judgment. Maya's phone buzzed against the marble countertop, a faint vibration that sent a ripple through the quiet. She glanced at the screen, the name Raven Pack flashing across the lock, a message unread. "We have eyes on the river. Be ready." The notification disappeared, a whisper of intrigue that left a knot in her stomach. She didn't comment, but her eyes flickered to the doorway, the dark silhouette of the messenger still standing there, his coat damp from the night's rain. "Did you hear that?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could decide whether to hide her concern. The messenger stepped into the kitchen, his coat flapping slightly, the badge on his lapel catching the pendant's light. His voice was neutral, almost rehearsed. "Alpha Ashford, the council awaits. They've also received a report from the Raven Pack. Someone claims they saw a shifter moving near the dock. They want answers." Luke's shoulders tightened, the pressure of his crest now a visible strain on his back. He glanced at Maya, the fear in her eyes mirrored his own. "We go together," he said, the decision already forming, his voice a quiet command that still carried the authority of his title. He reached for the envelope, feeling the paper's texture, the weight of the inked seal. He slipped it into his pocket, the act symbolic, a literal moving of his burden. Maya stepped forward, the blanket crumpled in her hands, the cat slipping onto her thigh, its fur pricking her skin. She lifted the wolf's tooth pendant, the small piece of ivory catching the light, a reminder that the past could be both weapon and heirloom. "Then we'll face them both," she said, her tone firm, a promise that felt like a shield. "But first, we need a plan." He nodded, his mind already racing, mapping out the council chamber, the possible arguments, the loopholes in the pack's ancient law that might allow an alpha to choose an outsider as a mate. He could feel the faint pulse of his own heart, a rhythm that matched the distant drums of the river's current. the hum of the city's distant traffic, the whisper of wind through the cracked window pane. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft chirp from the cat, its ears swiveling toward a faint sound coming from the balcony, the faint rustle of a tarp being folded, the scrape of a metal chain. He turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw a silhouette on the balcony, a figure partially obscured by the darkness, a hint of a coat, a glint of something metallic in their hand. The figure moved quickly, disappearing into the shadows of the building's exterior, the neon lights flickering against the night sky. Luke's breath caught, the sudden sight igniting a spark of alarm. "Someone's out there," he muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the concealed pocket where he kept a small, polished dagger, a relic from his father's collection, its handle worn smooth by years of use. He felt the weight of it, the balance between steel and wood, the memory of his mother's hands slipping over a similar blade years ago. Maya's eyes tracked the movement, her senses sharpening. "We need to check the balcony," she said, her voice low, the cat hissing softly, its fur standing on end. She moved toward the sliding glass door, the cool metal of the handle sending a chill up her arm. The sound of rain on the roof echoed in the hallway, a steady percussion that matched the rapid beating of her heart. He followed, the scent of pine and rain mingling with the metallic tang of the dagger as he slipped it into his coat pocket. The hallway's lights flickered, the older bulbs casting a yellowed glow that made the shadows dance. When they reached the balcony, the air was crisp, the city lights below a sea of glittering stars reflected in the river's surface. The wind tugged at his coat, the rain's remnants on his hair dripping onto the concrete, forming small rivulets that merged with the river's flow. On the balcony rail, a small, leather-bound notebook lay half open, its pages fluttering in the wind. The cover bore the Ashford crest, but the pages inside were not his mother's journal. They were filled with strange symbols, inked in a hurried hand that reminded Luke of the cipher he'd seen on a rival pack's banner weeks ago. He bent down, his fingers brushing the page, feeling the rough texture of the paper, the faint smell of ink and old tobacco that seemed out of place in the clean, modern space. Maya stood beside him, her eyes scanning the balcony, alert for any movement. "What is that?" she whispered, the question hanging between them. He lifted the notebook, the weight of it surprising, the pages turning to a sketch of a wolf's paw, inked with a red feather tucked into the print, a symbol he recognized from the Raven Pack's insignia. His mind raced, connecting the dots of the council's summons, the Raven Pack's reported sighting, and now this mysterious notebook appearing at his doorstep. He tucked the notebook into his coat, the leather cool against his skin, and turned to Maya, his eyes dark with a new resolve. "We have more pieces than we thought," he said, his voice low but firm. "The council, the Raven Pack, and now someone is trying to tip the balance. We need to know who and why before we step into that chamber." Maya's gaze lingered on the river, the way the current glistened under the city lights, the sound of distant sirens muffled by the night's damp. She inhaled deeply, the scent of wet concrete and river mud filling her lungs, grounding her even as the panic rose. "Then we find out," she replied, her tone decisive. "We can't let the council decide our fate before we understand the game they're playing." Luke felt the scar on his forearm tighten, a reminder that every choice pulled at old wounds. He placed a hand on the balcony railing, the metallic cold seeping into his palm, a physical anchor as his thoughts churned. "First, we go to the council and propose the new law. Then, after that, we investigate this notebook." He glanced back at the city, the neon signs flickering like warning lights, the river's surface reflecting a broken moon. "We'll split the work while you keep an eye on the Raven's movements. I'll handle the council. We'll need allies in both worlds." She nodded, the cat's soft purr resonating in her chest, the rhythm matching the beat of the river's current. "Deal, but we have to be careful. If the council thinks we're conspiring with the Raven Pack, they'll strip us both of everything." She pressed her thumb against the scar on her wrist, feeling the faint sting, the memory of that night's blood spatter still vivid. He turned his head, catching a glimpse of a flickering streetlight through the balcony's glass, a light that seemed to pulse in sync with the distant howl of a lone wolf. A sudden thought struck him. The council had always used the river as a secret meeting place for covert negotiations, and the Raven Pack had been known to use the same waters for smuggling. The intersection of those three threads, council, Raven, and the mysterious notebook, formed a tangled web that promised danger and opportunity. "Let's move," he said, stepping back into the kitchen. The cat hopped onto the counter, its eyes gleaming like amber beads, the faint scent of its fur mingling with the lingering pine. He pulled the notebook from his coat and placed it on the island, the pages opening to a map of the river's tributaries, marked with small red X's. "These look like rendezvous points," he observed, tracing a finger over one of the X's. "If someone's planning something, they're using the river's lesser-known streams." Maya leaned over the map, her eyes scanning the marks, the ink smudged in places where a hurried hand had traced over the lines. "One of these is near the old mill," she said, pointing to a spot that lay a few miles downstream. "That's where the council's hidden chamber is rumored to be, and it's also where the Raven Pack's scouts have been spotted recently." Her voice carried a hint of excitement, the kind that rose when she felt the chance to turn a threat into an advantage. He nodded, feeling the familiar surge of strategic thinking that had made him a corporate titan, now redirected to protect a pack and a woman who had once been his greatest mistake. "We'll go there tonight," he said, his tone decisive. "You'll gather what you can about the Raven's movements. I'll prepare my case for the council. We'll meet at the mill's old stone foundation, under the cover of darkness." Maya smiled, a flash of teeth that made the cat's ears perk up. "And if the council shows up there first?" she asked, a hint of sarcasm lacing her tone, but underneath a tremor of genuine fear. "We'll have to fight our way out, or we'll have to make a new alliance." He met her gaze, the scar on his forearm catching the light, a silent acknowledgement of the pain they both carried. "We'll decide together," he said, the words a pact. He reached for the notebook again, pulling out a folded piece of paper tucked inside a crude drawing of a wolf holding a broken chain. The image sparked a memory of his mother's last words before she vanished. "Never let the chain bind you, Luke. Let it be a reminder of what you can break, not what holds you." Maya tucked the owl's tooth pendant back around her neck, the metal cold against her throat, the weight of it a constant reminder of her own hidden past. "Then we break the chain," she whispered, the promise in her voice resonating like a chord struck on a string. The cat meowed softly, as if in agreement, its eyes glinting in the dim light. Luke felt the river's current in his mind, a steady thrum that mirrored his own pulse, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to hide behind a veneer of control. He let his hand rest on Maya's shoulder, the warmth of her skin seeping through his coat, the scent of wet wool and faint perfume mingling. "We do this because we choose to," he said, the words simple but potent. "Because we've learned that love isn't a rescue, it's a partnership. Because we've both been broken and we're ready to rebuild." She leaned into his touch, the scar on her wrist brushing his palm, the touch sending a spark that seemed to ignite something in both of them, a shared resolve forged from pain, fear, and a flicker of hope. The cat's purr rose, a low vibration that filled the room, as if echoing their unspoken oath. He glanced back at the door, where the messenger's coat hung, the faint crumple of the envelope in his pocket, the council's request waiting. The hallway beyond was dim, the sound of distant traffic muted by the rhythm of the rain still falling outside. He felt the pull of duty, the pull of destiny, and the pull of the woman standing beside him. "We'll leave in an hour," he said, his voice steady. "You get the notebook over to your contacts. I'll draft the amendment for the council." He gestured to the notebook, the map, the sketches, each a piece of the puzzle they were beginning to solve together. "And after that, we'll come back here, to this kitchen, and we'll see if we can finally make this place feel like home for both of us." Maya stared at the notebook, then at him, the cat's tail flicking in a slow, deliberate rhythm. "Home," she repeated, the word tasting like iron on her tongue, the idea both comforting and foreign. "Home is a crooked word for a place where you can finally stop looking over your shoulder. I'm willing to try, Luke, if you are." He smiled, a genuine curve that reached his eyes, the tension in his shoulders loosening like a rope finally released. I am, he said. He turned to the window, watching the river flow beneath the city's neon glow, the water reflecting the lights in a chaotic, beautiful mess. The river was a metaphor he had always clung to, ever moving, never still, always changing. It was time to let it carry them forward. Maya stepped back, the cat leapt onto the floor, padding silently toward the door, its paws leaving faint prints on the polished wood. She picked up the notebook, the weight of it a promise of work yet to be done. I'll meet the Ravens scout at the dock, she said, her voice firm, and see what they're really after. You handle the council. We'll meet at the old mill under the broken arches. No turning back. He nodded, the scar on his arm pulsing faintly as if echoing his heartbeat. No turning back, he repeated, the words a mantra that settled over him, grounding him in the present. He took one last look around the kitchen, the faint smell of coffee, the silver tooth pendant glinting in the low light, the cat's soft purr, then turned toward the hallway, his steps deliberate, each footfall a promise that he would walk this path, not as a lone alpha, but as a man willing to let someone else share the weight of his crest. The door closed softly behind them, the click echoing like a seal on a pact. The city outside roared with rain, sirens, and the distant murmur of wolves, but within those walls, a new rhythm began, a heartbeat shared, a promise whispered, a future waiting to be built on trust rather than dominance. The loops of mystery, who had left the notebook, why the Raven Pack was watching, what the council would really decide remained open, each a thread tugging at the fabric of their lives. But for the first time since that night under the full moon, Luke felt the fear of abandonment loosen its grip, replaced by a cautious, hopeful steadiness. Maya, feeling the warmth of his hand linger on her wrist, sensed that the lie she'd told herself that love was a burden might finally be ready to crumble, making space for something real, fragile, and worth fighting for. Luke stood in the council chamber, the cold stone walls echoing the murmur of dozens of wolves in ceremonial garb. The iron latch on the heavy door thudded shut behind him, sealing the room in a hush that felt like the breath of the old oaks outside. A single torch guttered on the far wall, casting a wavering amber light over the polished ashwood table where the elders had late rested. The scent of wet fur and old parchment rose from the stacks of treaties piled in the corner, mixing with the faint metallic tang of his own blood that still seeped from the cut on his forearm. He ran a gloved finger over the scar, feeling the raised tissue like a reminder of a night he could not forget. Alpha Ashford, you are summoned to answer for the breach, intoned the oldest elder, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The elder's eyes flickered to the crest on Luke's chest, then slid to the silver tooth pendant dangling from Maya's neck, the tiny fang catching the torch's light. Luke's heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a drum he tried to hide. Maya stood at the edge of the circle, her back pressed to the stone column, the blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. The cat she'd named Echo was coiled at her feet, its tail twitching with a nervous rhythm. She could taste the rain that still clung to her lips, the coppery edge of fear that always surfaced when the pack's judgment approached. Her left wrist bore the faint line of an old wound, the skin still pink where a fang had once grazed. She brushed the scar absent-mindedly with the tip of a finger, feeling the throb of old pain beneath the surface. You abandoned the hunt, forced me to flee, and now you bring me into your tower as a liability, the elder snarled, his breath smelling of pine sap and stale ale. Luke's mind flashed to the night the wolves had turned on him, the howl that ripped through the trees, the moment he had shouted for Maya to run. He had thought his command would protect the pack, that his authority could shield the one he loved. The memory tasted sour, a reminder that his fear of abandonment had become the very weapon he used to push people away. Maya's eyes narrowed. The torchlight caught the glint of a red feather tucked in her hair, a souvenir from the Raven Scout she had taken from a discarded feathered cap. She clenched her jaw, the muscles in her neck tightening like rope. You saved me once by forcing me out, she whispered, her voice barely above the echo of the council's murmurs. Now you try to rewrite the pack's laws with me as your proof of change. The words fell like stones, each syllable a reminder of the night she had watched Luke's silhouette dissolve into the trees, leaving her alone with a wounded heart. Luke swallowed, feeling the scar on his forearm pulse with each breath. "I am trying to protect us both," he said, the words tasting like ash. "If I let you stay, the council will see a shifter and condemn us." He glanced at the notebook Maya had given him earlier, its pages filled with sketches of wolf anatomy, the ink still wet on the margins. Somewhere in that book lay the key to controlling his own shift, but the council's eyes were already on him, judging every slip of paper as treason. The elder raised a clawed hand, pointing at the pendant. "That tooth belongs to a wolf you killed during the last hunt," he snarled. "Your blood is stained with it, and you wear it as a trophy." A ripple ran through the room as wolves shifted, their ears flicking to the phrase. Luke felt a cold sweep through his spine, the memory of that night when his pack had turned on a young shifter, the howl of the dying creature echoing in his mind. He had thought the scar on his arm was the only thing that mattered. The truth was deeper, a guilt he had buried beneath corporate deals and polished speeches. Maya's breath hitched. The cat hissed, ears flattened as if sensing the danger of a secret about to erupt. She remembered the night she had lost control, the pain of a fang slicing through her shoulder, the blood that had stained the pack's leaders, the way Luke had stared at her, his eyes flashing white with fear. She had blamed herself, convinced that her very existence threatened everything he cherished. The thought that Luke still saw her as a threat twisted inside her like a cold wind. "Do you think I will let the pack die for you?" Maya's voice rose, cutting through the stale air. "You keep repeating the same pattern, telling me I'm dangerous, then pulling me close when you need me." She stepped forward, the blanket slipping, exposing the scar on her forearm that matched the one on his. Their wounds mirrored each other, patterns of self-inflicted exile. The council's murmurs grew louder, a chorus of doubt that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of his own heart. Luke's fists clenched, the leather of his gloves cracking. He could feel the weight of the crest pressing into his sternum, a physical reminder that the pack expected him to be unbreakable. His mind raced to the map they had found on the balcony, the X marking the old mill, the hidden rendezvous that could change everything. He had wanted to use it to negotiate with the Raven pack, to turn a threat into an alliance. Now the council's gaze fixed on him, the plan felt like a fragile glass about to shatter. A sudden clatter echoed from the hallway, metal on stone. All heads turned as a messenger slipped in, his coat dripping with rain, a sealed envelope clutched in his gloved hand. He dropped it on the table with a thud, the parchment fluttering open to reveal a single line in hurried ink. "The river will flood at dawn. All routes sealed." The message was a loop unresolved, a new threat that could drown both packs if left unchecked. No one spoke, the air thickening with unanswered questions. Maya's hand flew to the pendant, the cold metal biting her skin, and she stared at the messenger's badge. "Who sent this?" she demanded, her voice taut as a bowstring. The messenger's eyes darted to the elder, then away, as if fearing the weight of his own secret. The elder lowered his clawed hand, his gaze never leaving Luke. "You have a choice, Alpha," he said, the words heavy as a falling tree. "Give us the notebook, the maps, the alliances you forged, and we will consider leniency. Refuse, and you both will be exiled him to the streets you claim to know, her to a fate worse than death." Luke felt the scar on his arm tear open in his mind, a phantom wound that burned with the memory of his mother's abandonment. He thought of the night he had forced Maya to leave, the cold wind snapping at his cheeks as he watched her disappear into the forest, the promise he made to never let anyone see his weakness. The promise had become his prison, and now the council offered a way out that required him to betray the trust they had just begun to stitch. Maya's eyes flicked to the notebook lying open, the ink of the last page smudged by rain that had seeped through the window earlier. She could see the faint outline of a sigil she hadn't recognized, a raven clutching a wolf's paw. It was a clue they had not yet decoded, a mystery that could expose a traitor within the council itself. The thought lingered, a tantalizing loop that might shift the balance of power if only they could survive long enough to follow it. I cannot hand over my people's secrets, Luke whispered, the words tasting like rust. If I do, the pack will think I am weak enough to bargain for love. He felt his throat tighten, the scar on his forearm pulsing as if the wound itself were breathing. He glanced at Maya, the cat now curled at her feet, its fur still damp from the rain, a living reminder of the fragile life they were trying to protect. Maya's shoulders slumped, the blanket falling to the floor in a sigh. The elder's eyes narrowed, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of pine and fear mingling on Luke's skin. Then you have chosen exile, he declared, the authority in his voice breaking apart the fragile hope that lingered between them. The door behind them creaked open, a silhouette stepped into the dim light, an unfamiliar wolf with a silver mask, his eyes glittering like ice. He slipped a small vial onto the table, the liquid inside shimmering amber. For the flood, he murmured, his voice a whisper that seemed to carry a secret of its own. The vial was another loop, a promise of a cure or a curse, its purpose unknown. Luke stared at the vial, at the messenger's envelope, at the notebook, at Maya's trembling hand. He could feel the weight of every decision he had ever made, each one a stone added to the pile that threatened to crush him. He thought of the first night under the full moon, the way Maya's eyes had shone with fierce fear, and how he had turned away to protect the pack. He realized he was about to repeat that exact motion, forcing her out again, this time under the guise of honor. Maya, he began, his voice cracking like a branch under ice. He reached for her hand, but his fingers brushed only the edge of the blanket, the cloth slipping away like the last of his resolve. She pulled the cat close, its fur warm against her cheek, and whispered, "You're still the same, Luke. You protect the pack by pushing love away." Her words cut through the torchlight, leaving a scar on his heart that matched the one on his forearm. She turned, the rain-soaked streets awaiting her outside, the promise of a second chance slipping through her fingers. Luke watched her silhouette dissolve into the hallway, the cat's soft meow echoing behind her. The council's murmurs rose again, the elder's claws tapping a slow rhythm on the stone. He stared at the notebook, the vial, the sealed envelope, all symbols of mysteries left unresolved. In that moment, the blackness of his fear solidified into a wall he could not breach. He turned to the elder, his jaw set, the crest on his chest feeling like a weight he could no longer bear. "Leave me to my exile," he said, voice low, each syllable a final surrender. The council's verdict was sealed, but the river's flood, the raven's secret, and the hidden ally in the shadows remained unanswered, threads waiting to be pulled in the storm to come. Now, at the threshold of his own destruction, Luke felt the cold air of the hallway kiss his cheek, the scent of rain and pine mingling with the iron taste of his own blood. He stepped forward, the stone floor echoing beneath his boots, each step a drumbeat toward a future he could no longer see, leaving the cottage of hope behind him, its door closing with a decisive click. Luke stood on the edge of the penthouse balcony, the night wind pulling at the lapels of his suit like cold fingers. Below, the river churned against concrete, a metallic roar that sounded like 1,000 wolves snapping at each other. He watched the water swallow a neon reflection of a broken clock tower and felt the familiar pressure of the crest against his sternum, a weight that had always reminded him to lead, never to lean. He'd inhaled the scent of wet asphalt and pine oil, the two aromas colliding in his throat. His thoughts drifted to the council's ultimatum, but the words that rose were not the rehearsed pledges he used in boardrooms. Instead, a memory of the night he forced Meyer into the woods flickered, her hand trembling, the moon catching the scar on his forearm, his own voice steadier than his heart. He remembered the exact moment he chose control over compassion, his fingers closing around the haft of a spear that never left his grip. The image sharpened, and his knuckles whitened around the rail. "Enough," he whispered, the sound lost in the river's hiss. He turned away from the water and walked back inside, the polished marble cool under his soles. The hallway was hushed, except for the low hum of the building's ventilation. At the far wall, a framed photograph of his father hung crooked, the glass flecked with dust. Luke's eyes lingered on the faint crack that ran through the frame, a fissure that seemed to echo his own hidden break. He stopped before the study door, thumb hovering over the knob. Inside the room lay the leather journal his mother had kept, its pages filled with notes on pack law. He could have taken it to the council as leverage, but the urge to use it as a weapon was replaced by something else, a quiet need to understand why he had always built walls. He opened the journal to a page marked with a red feather, a symbol he had seen on a rival's banner but never traced. The margin held a single line in his mother's tidy script: "Strength is shown when you let the pack see the cracks." A sudden buzz from his phone cut through the silence. A text from an unknown number: "The bridge at Willow Creek will be sealed at dawn. Meet me there." No name, no context. The message pulsed on the screen like a heartbeat. Luke felt the old instinct to ignore unknown summons, to lock himself in the safety of titles, but another part of him, the part that had watched Maya survive alone, whispered curiosity. He placed the phone down, closed the journal, and walked to the kitchen. The kettle whistled, steam curling into the cool air, mixing with the lingering scent of pine cologne on his skin. He poured a cup of black coffee, the bitter taste grounding him. As he lifted the mug, his hand brushed a small metal box tucked under the counter, a box he had never noticed before. Inside lay a silver pin shaped like a wolf's paw, its edges worn smooth by years of being hidden. He recognized it as a token from the old council archives, the one that signified a secret liaison among alphas long ago. He slipped it into his pocket, feeling the cool metal press against his palm, a reminder that trust had once been woven into the pack's history. That night, instead of drafting the amendment he had promised, Luke walked to the roof garden, the soil damp from the earlier rain. He knelt beside a planting of rosemary, its fragrant needles sharp against his fingertips. He dug his fingers into the earth, feeling the resistance give way, and thought of the times he had forced Maya to dig herself out of literal and figurative pits. He pressed his palm to the soil and made a quiet promise to ask for help before he decided alone, to let others see his crumbling foundation. He returned to his office and opened a fresh notebook, not the one Maya had given him, but one he would fill with his own observations. He wrote a single line: "When fear tells me to command, I will listen to the sound of my own breath instead." The pen scratched, the ink dark against the crisp page, and for the first time the thought felt less like a slogan and more like a habit he could practice. He closed the notebook, set it beside the coffee mug, and glanced at the city lights, each flicker a reminder that the world beyond the pack was vast, and that his role could be one of partnership, not solitary command. Maya huddled in the corner of the makeshift shelter, the fire escape above her rusted and humming with the wind. A thin sheet of rain traced lines down the cracked concrete, each drop a soft tap against the metal pipe. She cradled a battered notebook in her lap, the pages filled with sketches of wolf anatomy and scribbled equations for controlling the shift. The cat, her only companion, purred against her thigh, its fur warm and damp from the damp air. Maya pressed her cheek to the cat's head, inhaling the earthy musk of wet fur mixed with the distant scent of river mud. The night's cold seeped through the thin blanket, and a memory surged, the night she had lost control, the fang that had grazed her wrist, the howl of the pack turning into a scream. She recalled the moment she chose to run, to vanish into the city's shadows rather than stay and be a liability. The fear of hurting those she cared for had always driven her to disappear. She opened the notebook to a page she had marked with a red feather identical to the one on Luke's journal. "Fear of abandonment," she wrote in shaky ink, "leads to self-exile." She turned the page, and a fresh sheet waited. She lifted her pen, feeling the weight of the nib against her thumb, and wrote, "When the shift rises, I will not hide in the alley. I will stand in the open, even if the pack watches." She stared at the words, the ink still wet, and felt a tremor run up her arm, not from the chill but from the realization that she had been using exile as armor. A muffled knock against the shelter's metal door startled her. She lifted the blanket, her eyes narrowing as she saw a silhouette beyond the thin plywood, a courier in a dark raincoat. a sealed envelope clutched in his gloved hand. No badge, just a wax seal stamped with an unfamiliar sigil, two crossed arrows over a moon. Maya hesitated, the instinct to close the door and remain unseen warring with a sudden urge to discover who was reaching out. She slipped the notebook into her bag, the leather thudding softly, and opened the door just enough to take the envelope. Inside lay a single sheet of paper. The council plans a raid on the old mill at dawn. Bring the notebook. No signature. The words floated in the stale air, and a shiver ran through her spine, not from cold but from the echo of a promise she had made to herself to never be used as a pawn. She folded the paper carefully, feeling the crease crisp beneath her fingers, and slipped it into her pocket. She moved to the small kitchen area where a battered kettle sputtered, steam curling like ghostly tendrils. She filled a cup with water from a cracked faucet, the metal taste of rust mingling with the faint citrus of the tea bag she had salvaged. She drank, the warmth spreading through her chest, and then stood before the cracked mirror propped against the wall. Her reflection was fragmented, the glass splintered into a mosaic of her own eyes, one bright with resolve, the other still shadowed by doubt. She reached up, tracing the faint line of the scar on her wrist, feeling the scar tissue rise like a ridge. In that moment she made a choice. She would no longer vanish when the pack's expectations loomed. She would stay and learn to shift in the open, to let the elders see her power and decide for themselves. She grabbed her coat, its fabric worn but sturdy, and stepped onto the fire escape. The metal groaned under her weight, each rung a note of defiance. As she descended onto the street, the city's neon buzz washed over her, pink signs flickering, the distant clang of a train. She heard a siren far away, the wail slicing through the rain, and felt the pulse of the river beneath the bridges, a low thrum that matched the rhythm she was learning to control inside. She paused at the corner where a graffiti mural depicted a wolf howling at a moon made of steel. The paint smelled of spray and damp stone. She slipped the notebook from her bag and opened to a page she hadn't yet filled. She wrote a single sentence in bold ink. I will face the council not as a secret, but as myself. The pen's tip clicked against the paper, a sound as crisp as a wolf's fang. She looked up as a figure emerged from the shadows, a messenger in the same dark coat she had seen at Luke's door, his eyes scanning the street. He tipped his hat, a silent acknowledgement, and vanished into the rain. Maya felt the cat's meow echo behind her, a soft reminder that she was not alone, even when she walked the path alone. Both Luke and Maya, each in their own solitude, had taken a step that broke the pattern that had once torn them apart. Their internal obstacles, Luke's fear of vulnerability and Maya's habit of self-exile, had been met with a concrete action. Luke chose to document his breath before his command. Maya chose to present herself openly to the council. The loops they had opened, the mysterious feather, the sealed envelope, the silver pin, the unknown messenger still hung in the night, promising further revelations. As the river rose and the city held its breath, the two moved forward, unaware that their separate transformations would soon converge on the same stone bridge. Luke, now holding the silver pin, felt its cold edge press against his palm as he stared at the sunrise beginning to bleed over the skyline, a promise that the day ahead would test his new vow. Maya, clutching the notebook, felt the rain wash away the last of her doubt, each droplet a tiny herald of the change she was about to claim. Luke slipped through the river mist, boots slick on the stone steps of the abandoned mill. The air smelled of wet limestone and iron, a faint echo of the flood warning the council had whispered earlier. He cradled the leather notebook in one hand, the red feather tucked between its pages, and felt the cool weight of the silver wolf paw pin against his palm. He reached the cracked doorway just as Maya crouched beneath a broken beam. The notebook opened to a diagram of the pack's old irrigation tunnels. Her fingers traced the ink, the scent of river mud rising from the floor as she turned a page. Maya, Luke breathed, his voice barely louder than the water's rush. I brought the council's seal. He held out the tarnished metal crest, its emblem inverted, the letters smudged by rain. She stared at it, the wolf's tooth pendant catching the dim lantern light, then met his eyes. The scar on her wrist twitched, not from pain but from the memory of the night he had driven her away. Without a word, she slipped the notebook onto the floor and lifted the red feather, pressing it to his chest. The feather brushed his scarred forearm, stirring a shiver that was not fear. Luke placed the seal on the mill's stone altar, where his mother once swore to protect the pack. He knelt, his palms pressing into the cold surface, and whispered a vow he had never spoken aloud. The altar vibrated faintly, as if acknowledging his promise. A sudden crack split the night. A rival pack's torches flickered into view beyond the broken wall. Their snarling leader raised a spear, but Maya's hand shot forward, pulling a small vial from the notebook's pocket. She uncorked it. The amber liquid hissed, and a thick fog rolled over the floor, obscuring the attackers. Their eyes widened, pine oil scent mixing, and they hesitated. Luke seized the moment, stepping beside her, his alpha crest now a symbol of shared leadership rather than solitary command. He reached for the silver pin and slipped it into the notebook's binding, sealing their combined knowledge. The feather caught by gust. They stood, the beams creaking, river roaring, and the notebook lay open, pages unfinished. The hidden ally's clue, the messenger's identity, and the looming flood lingered, promising new tests even as they finally chose each other.